Welcome back to class. In this session, we're going to look at the major themes in chapters 28 and 29 of Jürgen's The Prize. As I mentioned in the last class session, these chapters can get a little bit choppy and confusing because he's jumping from theme to theme in each subsection, and so we're not so interested in outlining the chapters in these sessions, but rather looking at each theme in turn. And so in the previous class session, we looked at the extraordinary increase in the consumption and production of oil and oil-based energy in the post-World War II period, and a whole series of inventions and innovations and products and new applications for oil that dramatically changed the lifestyles and the life chances, not just of Americans, but of people all around the globe. In this class session, we're going to look at the theme of the politics of nationalization. Now, that term nationalization gets applied in a lot of different contexts to mean a whole variety of different things. For our purposes, we're thinking about the development of domestic political cultures in all those places around the world that had been, for the most part, colonies in the 19th century, and then between World War I and up to the end of World War II, had developed into a whole range of kind of political legal statuses. If you think of our discussion of the post-World War I settlement, places like Kuwait and Lebanon had become their own autonomous nation states. Their next door neighbors, Syria and Iraq, were put under those League of Nations mandates. And yet other places like the Dutch East Indies or India still essentially had the same legal status that they had had in the 19th century. In all of these places around the world, in the decade or two following the end of World War II, they emerged as their own autonomous nation states. And there's an internal cultural process where these peoples have to decide what does it mean to be an Iraqi? What does it mean to be a Syrian, right? What kind of government, what kind of economy are we going to have? What is our cultural identity? And that's both going to be extraordinarily diverse, right? Each country has its own unique story of the nature of its relationship to the colonizing power, the kind of different groups, communities within those territorial boundaries, the different ethnicities and whatnot, and tribes and family lineages that were all being kind of thrown together into one administrative kind of unit for the purposes of international relations, right? So it's an extraordinarily diverse story, but we're going to see common themes, right? One of the most popular things you can do if you live in one of these places, if you want to be a politician and be supported and get votes, right, from the voters, one of the most popular things you can do is be hostile towards the country that had colonized you. Right? This kind of anti-imperial sentiment, as we've talked about. And this is going to directly impact the ability of Western oil companies to come in and negotiate and maintain relationships with both the governments and the peoples in these different places. Jürgen's narrative arc over really till the end of this book is to see how this process changed and evolved from kind of the 50s and 60s into the 70s and 80s. And so we're going to track this idea of how the politics of nationalization is changing. You're going to see kind of different imagery and iconography of what authority is in each of these places. King Faisal in Saudi Arabia has a very different image of himself as why he is the ruler and what makes his rule legitimate, etc., than the Shah of Iran does. And we're going to see that, both the variations from country to country and also the variations over time. In terms of the nationalization of oil, the story really begins with the Latin American countries, Venezuela and Mexico, in the 1920s and the 1930s. Jürgen just sort of makes offhand references to Mexico and Venezuela in the chapters we're reading. He spent more time talking about Mexico, especially in several of the chapters that I did not assign, those chapters leading up to World War II. So he does spend more time on it in other parts of the text if you want to go look at those sections. Uh, we're really focused in these chapters in the build up to the OPEC oil embargo of the 1970s. So Jurgen is primarily focused on the countries of the Middle East. But it's worth spending just a moment just to talk about Venezuela and Mexico, both because they're first and because they're going to have a very different relationship to the United States and American oil companies than most of the countries in the Middle East. Now, just as we've tried to see the modern nation states of the Middle East emerging out of the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire after World War I, the nations of Latin and South America have their own kind of story of emerging out of first the remnants of the Spanish and the Portuguese empires, right? And a series of revolutions that start in the 1820s and kind of culminate in the 1840s, out of which the pretty close to the modern nation states that we have today in Latin America and South America emerge out of those revolutions. But then a century of kind of governance. Again, there's a great variety of nations here, so we're overgeneralizing. But a kind of century of rule under a system, what was known as the hacienda system, which is essentially a plantation society ruled by the large landowners in association with a military structure within each of these countries. So kind of formally, constitutionally, a military dictatorships, right? No constitutions or no effective constitutions in the way that we understand a constitutional system, but the real economic power residing in the agricultural productivity of these large plantations. By the end of the 19th century, many of those large plantations owned by American companies. As if you've heard of the United Fruit Company, which is the foundational company for the modern Dole brand, was an enormous landowner, and other European countries as well owned lots of land. And so the last quarter of the 19th century into the kind of first quarter of the 20th century, there were a series of United States military interventions in Latin American countries to kind of prop up this hacienda patron system. Then at the start of the 20th century, really leading with Mexico in the 19 teens, a whole succession of revolutions in these countries to kind of overthrow that hacienda military dictatorship system and put in place the varieties of kind of modern constitutions that we see today. And so the story of Mexico is a story of really a civil war in the 19 teens, where a bunch of different regional factions emerge to try to overthrow the dictatorship of General Porfirio Diaz. You may be familiar with the story of Diaz. That's going to culminate in the success of the revolution in 1920 and a new modern Mexican constitution and the birth of the PRM, the Revolutionary Party of Mexico. Right, that's the kind of coalition of forces that came together to get rid of the military dictatorship, but is essentially going to form a one-party state really up to the modern day. There have been only a handful of political parties that have won majorities in the presidency in Mexico that were not members of the PRM since 1920. One of the great grievances of the revolution against Diaz was the way in which Diaz had essentially contracted out to mostly American but plenty of other European companies to come in and build the industrial infrastructure that existed in Mexico. So perhaps most famously, all of the different railroad systems, the railroad tracks and the locomotives and the companies were owned by different American and European companies. And so Mexicans, when they paid their fare, that money went to foreign sources, and that was a great complaint of Mexico's. It was a very common way for European powers to kind of come in and take control of a place without formally colonizing it, and it happens all over the world, but with a special intensity in Mexico. So one of the kind of platforms of the PRM when it comes to power is we're going to seize back Mexico for Mexicans, right? We're going to take back our railroads, we're going to take back our water systems and our gas pipelines and oil wells and whatnot. And that culminates in 1938 under President Lázaro Cárdenas when the Mexican government passes a law expropriating all foreign companies, foreign oil companies' infrastructure in Mexico. So when we talk about what nationalization means, it means different things in different countries in terms of what legal change, what contractual rights it takes from the Western companies. And we're going to see, particularly in the Middle East, different countries have, sometimes it's just renegotiating the contract with the Western company, and the home country, the domestic country, is going to get a larger share of the profits. The most radical form of nationalization is what we call expropriation. And that's literally, Texaco came in and they spent tens or hundreds of millions of dollars building all these oil wells, building roads and pipelines to transport the oil. And the Mexican government passes a law that says, hey, Texaco, we know you spent tens of millions of dollars building all this stuff. You no longer own it. The Mexican government now owns that. So that's literally, theft of property. It's something that you had previously given that company the legal right to come in and do this. The company had a title of ownership under the previous government, and now the new government says that title of ownership is no longer valid. We assert ownership over. Right? So that's the most radical and extreme form of nationalization. We're going to see other varieties of that. There's a whole lot of kind of intermediate steps you can take to assert greater control over Western oil assets without completely seizing ownership. So Mexico presents a really unique example, it's an idiosyncratic example that illustrates the diversity of approaches, because on the one hand, Mexico takes the most radical legal political step that you could possibly take. You just no longer own this. On the other hand, as we'll see in the coming chapters, Mexico never is one of those radical OPEC countries that's trying to stick it to the Western powers. You'll see over and over and over again that Mexico hangs with, if you will, the United States, Canada, Britain, France, that is, the Western European countries in the geopolitics that we're going to talk about over the next few chapters. So on the one hand, Mexico did the most radical thing you can imagine a country doing to the Western oil companies. On the other hand, they largely stay aligned with the United States, and that's really the result of two overwhelming factors. One is the way in which the United States has exerted sort of political influence and oversight over the entire region of Latin America and South America from the beginning of the 19th century. If you're familiar with the Monroe Doctrine of the 1820s, the United States essentially declared early in the 19th century, you Europeans can go colonize the rest of the world, but Latin America and South America is our special sphere of influence, and anybody who comes over here can expect to be met with American military, might. And that was true all through the 19th century. So the United States has a very special, it's not a direct colonization, but it is a kind of protection and control. Right? And it's very different than the way the Europeans worked in Asia and Africa and the Near East. So Mexico is always limited in what it can do in distancing itself and being hostile to the United States. The other really important factor here is because Mexico is geographically adjacent to the United States, an enormous part of its infrastructure was already integrated into the United States oil infrastructure. That is to say, the great majority of that Texaco pumped oil in the from 1900 up through the 1930s especially, was ending up in the refineries along the Gulf Coast. That is, those Texaco ships were just taking them across the Caribbean and taking the oil across the Caribbean and unloading in Shreveport. And so all of that infrastructure is really one large system. And that also limited the ability of Mexico to be sort of politically hostile to the United States in the way that we're going to see the Middle Eastern countries became aggressively hostile to the European powers and ultimately the United States. So uh, Latin America is its own unique story that we're not devoting nearly enough time to in this class, but it just illustrates the diversity of the politics of nationalization. Let's turn now and look at several of the countries that Jürgen spends more time on in these chapters. Iran is probably the most important country to understand if we're going to get our arms around Jürgen's narrative. Iran is going to transform itself first from being a kind of British puppet state or client state in the interwar period. It's going to emerge as the United States' closest ally in the region under the Shah all through the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. And then there will be a revolution in Iran and the rise of a Shia Islamic government under the Ayatollah Khomeini, and Iran will become the United States' most hostile enemy in the region by the end of this story. So Iran is really a central figure. If you remember where we left off the story of Iran in the earlier class session, in the post-World War II period, Britain was most desirous of maintaining its control or its influence in Iran and Iraq. Britain is greatly weakened at the end of the war, so they have to recruit those American companies, especially Exxon and Mobil, to come in as kind of economic partners in both of those countries, but they want to maintain their kind of political influence, if you will. So Iran had established itself constitutionally on the British model. That is, they had this guy, the Shah, who was sort of the equivalent of the British king, and they also established a national legislature with a prime minister and a kind of proper parliamentary system. That system or that model quickly came undone under the prime ministership of Mohammad Mossadegh, who was popularly elected in 1951 on a campaign of, we're getting ripped off by the British oil companies. The Britain is an imperial, still being an imperial power over us, and what we need to do is nationalize Iranian oil. We need to demand that the Iranian people own the oil that is beneath their soil, and therefore the Western companies are going to have to renegotiate with us and redistribute the profits from that oil more equitably, more fairly. So there is this question. Mossadegh is not an advocate for expropriation in the way that the Mexican Revolutionary Party of Mexico was for outright expropriation. He's making a kind of political principle or a principle about Iranian sovereignty, and he's definitely a guy on the left. That is to say, he's a kind of social democrat liberal. He wants to use those tax dollars or those oil profits to build roads and build schools and build water treatment plants and sewerage facilities. That is to say, to elevate Iranians' lifestyles and standard of living to the equivalent of Western Europe, and that's really his focus. So there's always this question about to what extent are these advocates for nationalization really communists who are in the back pocket of the Soviets, right? And they're just Soviet agents trying to draw Iran or whatever country it is into that's very much the way the Americans tend to view this stuff. So Mossadegh is elected in 1951. He introduces a nationalization bill which passes the Iranian legislature, and the British government comes to the American government and essentially says, we cannot allow this bill to pass. If we allow them to nationalize their oil, we'll lose all control and they're going to get drawn into the Soviet orbit, et cetera, et cetera. So the British Secret Service, MI5, you may be familiar with it, and the American precursor of our, today we have the CIA, it was called the OSS, and the decade or so after World War II, conducted a covert operation in Iran. They essentially went into the major cities of Iran with suitcases of money, passed out, paid people to go out and protest and riot against Mossadegh and the nationalization law. And what that led to is kind of civil unrest that then they encouraged the Shah to declare martial law to impose, to prevent the outbreaks of violence and to arrest Mossadegh. And so you see in the picture in the lower right on your screen, well, the two pictures on the right hand side, Mossadegh was the prime minister and on the cover of Time magazine there in his suit and tie. And in the lower picture, that's Mossadegh being put on trial for treason against the Iranian nation. He is going to be convicted, thrown in jail, and he dies in jail soon after. That he died of natural causes is perfectly plausible. I think we think that he probably caught tuberculosis or something like it in jail, got sick, and died within a few years of being convicted. So here you see a kind of supported revolution. So the Shah now is going to continue to have a national legislature, but the lesson of what happened to Mossadegh is going to kind of persist, and he's going to become essentially a military strongman ruler, in which parliament is just a kind of fig leaf facade of constitutional order, and increasingly the Americans are going to have to supplant the British in propping up his rule. And we're going to watch kind of the deterioration of the Shah's rule as he becomes more of a dictator, more of a police state, until ultimately it culminates in the 1979 revolution. But that's a couple of decades away, and there's a kind of high water period of Iranian alliance with the Americans and the British. Now, the thing about Mossadegh is, of all these radicals that we're going to look at, from Cardenas we just saw before, the leader of the PRM, Mossadegh really is the most kind of European liberal, right? He believes in a constitutional order. He believes in property and contract and free markets and all the rest. He just thinks that the people of Iran ought to benefit more from the extraction of their own resource. That is to say, this is one of the safest guys of all the leaders of these nationalization movements. He is the one that is sort of culturally most in sync with the at least political constitutional expectations of Americans and Western Europeans. But because the Americans are so focused on the Cold War and the rivalry with the Soviet Union, any movement within any of these countries that seems to be going against American interests can be interpreted as sympathetic to the Soviets, rival to our own interest, etc. And that really is kind of the overtones of the story of Mohammad Mossadegh. This is really the defeat by the Western powers of the chosen elected representatives of the people of Iran. Now, how fair voting rights are in Iran, etc., is a different question, but symbolically, that's what the story of Mossadegh represents. So, the first movement, now ultimately the Shah is going to nationalize the oil. He's going to create a thing called the National Iranian Oil Company. So Iran will officially own the oil, but in substance, all it means is a very mild renegotiation of the contracts and the Iranian government receiving a very modestly larger share of the profits than they had done before. That's going to change again in the early 70s when we get to the OPEC negotiations, but the Shah never imposes anything close to expropriation. So British Petroleum and Amoco and Exxon still own those refineries, still own the pipelines. They just renegotiate the split essentially on the sale of the oil. Now, Iraq was, if you recall, the central object of the British ambitions in the post-World War I period. The whole point of the Mesopotamian campaign and then the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the San Remo Agreement was to create this League of Nations mandate for this thing called Iraq, which was really artificially constructed from three very distinct provinces under the Ottoman Empire. the lower southern, the Basra area, the central area around Baghdad, and the northern area around Mosul. Well, if you remember our discussion, what the British wanted to accomplish was to be able to get from the headwaters of the Persian Gulf up to the oil resources in northern Iraq around Mosul, and to be able to construct transportation routes to get that oil out to the Persian Gulf. And no country in the post-World War II period more vividly illustrates the implosion of British imperial power. Right? In the aftermath of World War II, Britain is a greatly weakened economically, and all around the world its empire is imploding on it. And Iraq is the most dramatic kind of case study of that here in the countries that we're looking at. So if you recall, that rivalry between the House of Saud and the Hashemite family for the kind of political control of the different countries that were being created. And if you look on your screen on the left-hand side, King Faisal Hashem, that's the grandson of that first King Hashem, who initially the British put on the throne of Syria, and the Syrians revolted against him almost immediately, and so the British then said, well, okay, you can then be the king of Iraq. And we now come by the post-World War II period to that guy's grandson, King Faisal Hashem. He's actually the second, because his dad had a different first name. I can't recall at the moment. And so no country in the Middle East more clearly illustrates British imperial control, right? King Hashem, King Faisal, his government really only effectively controls the major cities and the transportation routes to the oil fields, and only because there are British troops stationed in all of those locations to protect those routes. In other words, it really is a hostile occupying government for most of this period. That's all going to come to an end in 1958. A group of Iraqi generals under the leadership of this guy you see in the middle of your screen, General Abda al-Karam Qasim, they're going to rise up and overthrow King Hashem. They're going to assassinate him. They're going to beat the heck out of his body and tie him to the back of a car bumper and drag him through his body through the streets of Baghdad as crowds of Iraqis come out and chant and cheer and throw rocks at the body. And ultimately they're going to string the body up by its ankle from a lamppost in downtown Baghdad and broadcast it on national TV in Iraq in 1958. And this is the Iraqi Revolution against British imperial authority. It's one of the most violent, dramatic overturning of any of these governments that got created in the post-World War I period. And now Qasim himself, there's not a particular political ideology behind his rule. It's really a kind of clique of generals, and he's the leader of this clique of generals. It's a kind of imposition of martial law, of military rule for the sake of maintaining peace. It's only going to last about 5 years, and then Qasim himself gets assassinated, and there's a period of kind of civil war unrest where there's no effective government. In fact, calling it a civil war kind of exaggerates the organization of the sides. It's really tribal street gangs in the major cities fighting street battles all throughout Iraq. The country and the oil production essentially shuts down through this whole period. Out of that chaos is going to emerge the Iraq Ba'ath Party, first under this guy Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, and then ultimately you are probably familiar with the character of Saddam Hussein. Now, Ba'athism is a political ideology, and it has its roots in Syria with a guy named Michel Aflaq in the 1940s and the 1950s. You really want to think about Ba'athism. This is kind of an overgeneralization, but the easy way to think of it is a kind of Arab version of European fascism, right? This is essentially Nazism rewritten for an Arabic culture. In Baathism, the party is everything. Everybody belongs to the party. Everybody submits to the party. Even the government is subservient to the party. It's a one-party state, right? So it's a complete authoritarian system. And it's very popular in Syria. Most of the varieties of Syrian political parties are sort of competing Ba'athist parties. And in Iraq, it's going to emerge under this character. Bakr is kind of the diplomat, the spokesperson, but this whole time Saddam Hussein is kind of the enforcer behind the scenes. He runs the secret police, and he's the one that abducts people and tortures people. And finally, in 1979, Hussein is going to assassinate al-Bakr and establish it a one-party and a one-ruler state. Saddam Hussein is kind of the voice of the Ba'ath Party. So Iraq experiences really 3 decades of just chaos and turmoil and internal unrest. The process of nationalization, the nationalization of their oil reserves then, is really timed not so much as a kind of marker of the ideology of the ruling clique, right? It's not more or less communist in the way that goes, but it just reflects the chaos of the period and the attempt to try to secure, essentially to maintain oil production amidst all of this violence and unrest. So when the generals take over after they assassinate Hashim, they pass what Jurgen refers to as Public Law 80, which simply says Iraqi oil reserves are the property of the Iraqi people. It's not until 1964 that the Iraq National Oil Company is established, and we'll talk more about Iraq when we get to the OPEC negotiations of 1971, but it's not until 1971 that they essentially expropriate, that is, fully seize control and ownership of all the different oil infrastructure that the European countries, British and American companies have created there. Now, what's ironic about this, of course, is we saw when we're discussing Iran previously, you have a guy Mossadegh who really is a kind of liberal Democrat. He's very much in the Western European parliamentary system mode, but the Americans perceive him as a Soviet agent, right? Or at the very least an asset through his own impulses is going to draw Iran into the Soviet orbit. What is the irony here is that there are probably nobody, maybe the King Saud and the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia, but nobody is less communist than Baathists, right? Baathists are fascists. They're Nazis. The Nazis hated the communists, right? So in their political ideology, Baathism is very different than communism. But it was Iraq, and as we'll see in just a second, Egypt, were the two countries that became most explicitly allies of the Soviet Union, that allowed themselves to take, Soviet weapons shipments and whatnot, and to represent sort of Soviet interests in this region. So you have this irony of someone who is not particularly communistic and really pretty hostile to communism as a philosophy, as a structure of government, nevertheless creating explicit alliances with the Soviet Union because it was they perceived in Iraq's sort of strategic interest to have Soviet weapons to oppose the British and the Americans with. So you see how the domestic political philosophy or ideology is not like a one-to-one clue to how countries are going to align in terms of their geopolitics, and Iraq is really a perfect example of that. More than anything else, what Iraq shows is just chaos and disorder and tumult, right? This really shows there's no country that's more artificial in its original creation, that is, 3 groups of people who were very distinct culturally, politically, everything under the Ottomans, all kind of stitched together into this Frankenstein country, right? It made the political boundaries of Iraq make no sense in terms of the ethnic communities that live there. And so you see the most kind of dramatic imposing of Western imperial rules upon a native peoples. And here you see the consequence, which is really 3 or 4 decades of just chaos and violence and bloodshed and just horrible consequences for the people that live there. So nationalization in this context represents this kind of implosion of the old imperial order. Now, a country that we have not talked about yet is Libya, and this is a good example of the kind of chopped up storytelling of Jurgen in these chapters. He really refers to the development of Libya as a nation and its oil resources in little subsections that are spread throughout 27, 28, and 29, and it can become a kind of convoluted story for that reason. Now, for if you look at the map on the upper right-hand side of your screen, you see that map of the old Ottoman Empire. Libya is going to be created in that kind of beige no man's land that's labeled Senussi there. Now going all the way back to the kind of pre-modern times in this this coast of North Africa, there have always been kind of two great areas of civilization. Egypt on the east side, you're very familiar with, the Nile River Valley and all of that. The cities of Cairo and Alexandria go all the way back to the Roman and the pre-Roman period, of course. You may be less familiar with the kind of civilization and settlement on the western side of the north coast of Africa, the area around Tunisia and Algiers. If you're familiar with Roman history, this was the site of the great Carthaginian Empire, and the Carthaginians and the Romans fought for centuries for dominance of the Mediterranean. Essentially, there's this Atlas mountain range that's just in from that coast, that kind of northern outcropping there, and on the plains of the Atlas Mountains, there are opportunities for agriculture and livestock herding and whatnot. So that little area across from Spain has always supported human civilization going back to the ancient period. Then there is this vast desert that separates these two ancient civilized areas, right? This sort of essentially no man's land with nomadic tribes and whatnot, and really no effective government. You can see there on the map that green area. The Italians, of course, in the 20s and 30s, and their rising fascist power are trying to create a colony. And so where do they go? They go to the coast of North Africa, where neither the French or the British have made any serious developments or are making any serious efforts to defend that territory. So the area of North Africa that's going to become Libya has been since ancient times a kind of no man's land between two great areas of civilization on each side of it. That label Senussi there that you see on that map really refers to one of the great tribal families. And then if you look on the left-hand side of your screen, this guy, King Idris el-Senussi, was the first monarch of the modern state of Libya. So in the aftermath of World War II, with the Italians being defeated, their claims on this section of North Africa are taken away from them, and there's really nothing of value. Jürgen tells you that the biggest economic activity in this area in the early 1950s was scrap meddling. That is, local tribesmen going around and collecting up the blown up tanks and aircraft and whatnot from World War II and scrapping the metal. That was the biggest industry in this area. But the Americans are very, very interested in this patch of desert because they're trying to project a defense of Europe, right? The nuclear arsenal that's going to defend Western Europe against the Soviet Union. We haven't developed really effective ballistic missiles, that is, intercontinental ballistic missiles. So the delivery of atomic weapons has to be by airplane in the immediate post-World War II period. So the Americans want to establish an air base out here in the deserts of North Africa, because that air base will put them within range of Europe to project their nuclear shield to protect Western Europe against the Soviets. So long before, not long before, but years before any oil is discovered in these deserts, the Americans are interested in building an airbase, so they bring to the United Nations the proposal to create a nation of Libya. And they essentially grab this guy, King Idris, who you can see his picture there. He's essentially an old tribal sheik, really had no political role leading up to World War II, and they simply select him to be the monarch of this region, and the United Nations votes to create the modern nation state of Libya, and they essentially appoint King Idris el-Senussi to be the king of this new nation. Very soon thereafter, though, by the late 50s, there are American oil companies exploring around on kind of the eastern edge of the modern nation state of Libya, and eventually they're going to discover the first oil deposits and get the first oil gushers. I think Jurgen tells you in 56 and 57, but that the major production will really start up in the mid 1960s, and it'll be a variety of two different groups, the Amarada group and Marathon, under this label, the Oasis group. And virtually as soon as the oil revenues start pouring into this totally artificial creation, this thing called the government of Libya, competition among the different tribes for kind of revenue sharing, right, of the oil profits emerges, and you get a period of kind of low-level civil war, but ultimately leads to another coup by a group of military generals led by this guy, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. And Gaddafi is going to make himself kind of dictator of Libya up until the turn of the 21st century. He will be a kind of strongman ruler, and Gaddafi's political ideology is really fascinating. It's sort of half communistic, right, and sort of pays homage to Marx and Lenin, but it mixes in an emphasis on his Islamicism. That is to say, there's a particular religious interpretation of Islam that really celebrates Gaddafi as kind of the second coming, right, the new Muhammad who's here to lead us. And so it's this combination of Islamicism. He writes this book called The Little Green Book as a kind of homage, if you know anything about China and Mao Zedong. And Mao Zedong, the Chinese had this thing called the Little Red Book, and every Chinese citizen was required to carry the Little Red Book on them at all time. And it was essentially a bunch of Mao's sayings, right? It was just sort of indoctrination into the communist philosophy of the Chinese Communist Party. So as a kind of homage to Mao's Little Red Book, Gaddafi writes this thing called the Little Green Book, and it's not pure Marx and Lenin. It's sort of the principles of Marx and Lenin folded into sayings from the Quran, sayings from Muhammad, right? You know, the religious tradition of Islam. So Libya becomes this really strange place where it's sort of Marxist communist, it's sort of Islamicist, but it's more than anything a kind of bizarre cult of personality around Muammar Gaddafi, not unlike if you're familiar with North Korea and the Jong-un family and their kind of cult of personality rule. So it becomes a really strange place, Libya, and Jurgen's going to tell you a series of stories of just what a thug Gaddafi is, that he physically threatens the oil executives when they're in contract negotiations with them, that it's this own revolutionary state. Gaddafi is going to become one of the major supporters of kind of revolutionary activity throughout Africa and Latin America. He'll use his oil profits to buy guns and arms and whatnot for revolutionary groups all throughout Africa. And so he's not really like any of the other examples. Again, here's another unique example that is the product of the particular colonial story, or the story of the transition from colonial status to nationhood, that's very unique to Libya.